Welcome to session 3 of day 4 of Local GovCamp 2020. And this is going to provide attendees with a practical guide to making your website accessible for everyone. And it's hosted by Alex Jackson, Head of GovPress, and Callum Ryan, Accessibility Lead, both at DXW. So over to you, Alex and Callum.
Right, I'm hoping very much that everyone can see that. And when I do this, it changes.
Spot on.
Yeah. Cool. Are we ready?
Yes, brilliant.
Cool. I'll start by introducing us. My name is Alex Jackson. I work at DXW. I'm the head of the GovPress team. I'll be presenting today with Callum. Callum, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Callum. I'm working in the GovPress team, also as an accessibility lead, as developer as well.
So you'll be hearing from the two of us for the next little while. We've got a few slides which hopefully shed some light on what we're talking about. It's not perfect, but hopefully there's something useful in here for you. So quick introduction to GovPress and DXW. I will keep this short. DXW, we're a digital agency. We've been around for 11 years. We work pretty well exclusively with the public and third sectors. We do lots of things, anything from digital strategy to digital delivery, user research, design, service development, operation, big websites, small websites, big services, little services, and everything in between. Lots of us are former public and civil servants, and we're motivated as a company by working for the public good. GovPress, which is my bit, we're the team at DXW who focus on WordPress. While the rest of the company is a reasonably technology agnostic approach to things, we as a team specialise in all things WordPress. We've been working with WordPress for pretty well all the time that the company's been around, and we think it's still a good choice for an awful lot of websites. As part of that, recently we've been doing an awful lot of work on accessibility, which won't be a huge surprise, so we're going to talk about some aspects of that today.
Okay, so the accessibility guidelines are now legal requirement for any public sector website to adhere to, and this accessibility campaign at GovUK gives you an overview of what those rules are. To the next slide.
I'm trying. There we go.
And the guidelines, specifically WCAG 2.1, that's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, have a complete list of the guidelines which you need to adhere to if you have a website. They're not exactly bedtime reading, but they are, in this example, a good reference if you're looking to understand exactly what each of those criteria are. Next slide. So I wanted to start by looking at one of those areas where a lot of websites, or if you're like a content author or anybody involved in making changes to websites, you need to be aware of how your content is structured. Next slide. Now, in terms of criteria for a website, there are several criteria for each of these topics we're going to discuss today. I've listed here 4 which are applicable to how you structure your content. So if you have those references I just referred to for the different criteria open, you can read a little more about each of those criteria and how they apply to when you're writing content. Next slide.
Sorry, this is having fun here. Where have I gone? That's the right one, isn't it?
Okay. So the easiest way for me, I guess, to explain some of these, I'll just go back as I said. Back again. There eventually. So explaining some of the accessibility challenges that you probably faced when you're writing content on the web. This is an example where we found headings used in the wrong way for looking at how people interpret their content on a website. Typically, if a user is using a screen reader or assistive technology, they'll go through each of the headings on the page and try and find the certain piece of content that they're looking for based on the headings. In this example, we have headings in bold, which aren't, in terms of the code, correct because they have the strong element around them. So imagine if you're putting together a page and the content, imagining how you're doing that. You might think it's simpler just to put these bold styles on text just so it looks like headings. What you're actually doing there is breaking the rules against the criteria, basically. So if you have not used proper headings for your content, you're not using the correct structure. Effectively, you're making it harder for somebody to browse that content if they have a disability. Next slide. So here you can see how a screen reader will interpret that page. You can quite clearly see the headings there. You have the top heading, but then there's all these headings that aren't there. And those headings aren't there because the content hasn't been marked up correctly. And that is a very common problem we see in a lot of pages where the content isn't structured in the way that makes it as accessible as possible. Next slide. Now here in an example we have for one of our most recent blog posts, you can see the content is structured. So you have the headings from 1 to 3. You can see the priority of the headings. You can see which headings are relevant to the article. So you have 1, 2, 3. In that case, you can actually tab through each of the headings and easily get to the content that you're looking for. So if you're looking for a piece of content within that article, you can just tab through and go direct to that content. Or if you're looking for something outside that article, you can clearly see from there which of the headings are relevant to the general page. Next slide.
So I'm going to talk a bit now about what the standard says about language. We work with a lot of organisations, and we know that most organisations want to publish content that people can understand. However, it can be really difficult to actually get to that point and to create content which is genuinely understandable. So we reckon that the standard and the changes to the regulations around the duty on public sector bodies are a good opportunity to help you publish better content. So this isn't an exhaustive list of what's in the standard at all, but here are some samples of what the standard says about language. It talks about unusual words. This is a part of the AAA compliance. There are 3 levels of the standards, A, AA, AAA, in an increasing kind of level of difficulty. And these are all AAA. The standard does talk about quite a lot of other things, and it is worth reading, particularly the quick ref guide that we linked to earlier. But on these 3, unusual words and abbreviations, a lot of domains have got specialist language or technical language, and that's fine. But you can help your users understand your content by providing definitions of those words. Abbreviations, you know, the public sector runs on TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. The standard says there should be a way for users to find out the expanded abbreviation or its meaning. Another interesting part of the standard is around reading level. Now, AAA requires that there's a version of text available that doesn't require a reading ability above lower secondary education. This is quite difficult to assess, and you'll see in my slides in a minute that I've kind of tried to give some indication of ways you might want to go about it. And it's also less applicable to content that's aimed at a specialist professional audience. But even in those cases, it is possible to create a short summary that tells people what the content's about. That is also of benefit to busy specialists and professionals, because it means that they can quickly check that they are on the right page and reading the right content for them at a given time. It's also the case, I think this probably goes without saying, but I'm gonna, that for specialist and technical content, sentences should still be well written and as simple as possible, even if the jargon or vocabulary of the particular field you're in is somewhat obscure. Put together, these parts of the standard don't themselves preclude using technical language or abbreviations, but they do encourage you to write as clearly and simply as possible, as well as making sure that jargon and abbreviations are explained. There are lots of ways of doing this type of thing. So this is a sample from a report that we found. The report's 102 pages long. This glossary of terms was 6 pages of that. which may have been appropriate, but we did have a look through, and quite a lot of the acronyms that are in here aren't actually used in the report, which rather kind of leads you to ask, well, why are you defining them here? Is that actually useful? This is an example from gov.uk. It's not a particularly good screenshot. It was really hard to try and do a screenshot as well as do hover. But if you see where the EU bit is at the top, near the top of that sample, you can see that there's a little hover pop up, and there's also a link to explain what the EU is. And I'm sorry about the Brexit content here. This is around language and use of. This is some pretty nasty content. The first sentence of this is 41 words long, with a large number of those words possibly considered complex. As I said before, it's difficult to assess, reading level, I think that would be fair to say, which is why there are so many different indicators. I stuck this into an online readability calculator and it cried. This is not specialist content. This is a piece of campaigning content from the government. I would argue that this is not written as well as it should be. Shorter sentences that do one job well are better than long, complex sentences, and that first sentence is certainly an example of a long, complex sentence. Like, I'm perfectly capable of understanding the concept described in it, and I know the words, but it's so complicated I had to read it twice, and I had to break it apart in my head to understand what it was trying to convey. As a side note, the rest of that website also annoyed me quite a lot. For example, in the people section of this, they talk about T-level providers. I could have done an explanation of that. And in the places section, there's a sentence which says that we are increasing connections, which just seems deliberately obscure. Anyway, rant aside. It is perfectly possible to write clearly and simply about complex subjects. Again, this is a gov.uk example. I'm sure you're probably sick of seeing these, but there's a significant amount of complex content in here. It's broken down into clearly named sections. It makes good use of bullet points for clarity, and it links off to useful information about the different sections so that users can actually achieve what they're aiming to. Here's a slightly different example from a different GDS, which is no longer called GDS, but the Government Decontamination Service was a very obscure piece of government who I happened to meet at some point, and they deal with nuclear contamination and decontaminating things after accidents. So it's really specialised content, and not that many people are going to need it, but they've taken a really similar approach. I stuck a sample from their guidance into the readability calculator, and this scored better than the examples from the Northern Powerhouse, which I thought was quite interesting. The fact that the marketing content about that was so obscure that even advice about how to decontaminate areas after you've spilt some nuclear waste was more readable. A final little note on language, 2 examples here, this time literally about which language you're writing in. So identifying which language the content is in is part of meeting the standards so that the software can detect kind of what it's looking at. In this case, this is Welsh. You can just about see at the bottom of the blue highlight CY, which is the abbreviation for Welsh. And in here, an example, ES, Spanish. Tables and data, back to Callum.
So yeah, tables. We're in a world of data-driven content, and the information we convey is important to everybody who's looking at it. So if they can understand that data and determine it however they decide to access it, it's important that we use a way that is most accessible to everybody. So information relationships is the main criteria we're looking at here. Relationship of cells sharing the same row column, and the relationship of each cell to its row and or column header are necessary for understanding. Now this is an area where typically if somebody is creating a table to represent data, we often find the problems in the way that people decide to do that. Next slide. Here's an example, a table, similar to a previous example looking at bold text, where what we intend to be the headings of the table are simply bold text, and if a user is going through and looking at that content on a screen reader or any kind of assistive technology, which is allowing them to find out what the headings of the table are, they won't be able to tell simply through it being bold text. So further down, we have the right way of doing it. This is using a table header element. And also above that, we have the caption of the table, which gives the user who's perhaps just navigating through the page to find out what the headings are and what the headings of tables are, to understand what the context of each of those tables are. Next slide. So actually finding a way of creating tables, if you're not somebody who writes code every day, is maybe something which you find quite challenging. Now, there are plugins. A lot of our clients, we use WordPress. There are similar ones for CMS. But TablePress here gives you that option to create the caption, title, and the headings for the table. It just allows you to then focus on inputting the data without worrying about so much, is your table accessible, and have you given all the meaning and context to each of those data elements. Next slide. Now, there's a whole lot of writing and articles about how to put together data tables. Bruce Lawson is a good advocate for this, and he's put together a list of useful links. That's on brucelawson.co.uk/2020/accessible-data-tables. Another area of looking at visualizing data is pie charts, graphs, and charts. Now, what we see in a lot of websites is these are simply put into articles and blog posts as images, and that presents, again, criteria which aren't met. Typically, these are contrasts. The colors you can see here would not meet the minimum contrast levels for the WCAG 2.1 criteria. And that effectively stops a large number of people with disabilities from viewing that content and being able to understand what the data is about. And similarly, because it's an image, if there's no alternative form in text, the user can't understand what is inside that pie chart. Next slide. Now, in terms of how you present your data, there are a lot of challenges in how you do that in an accessible way and still make it visually engaging and not simply a big table of data. So this is like one example where you can, it's not free, but you can choose different options to visualize your data in an easier way if you're not wanting to write your own code. So evervis.com if you want to do that. Next slide.
Sorry, unmute myself. Callum just talked about images a bit there. I'm going to talk a bit more about images. We know that publishers want to use images. They make the websites look better. They enhance the presentation of your content. They make it more engaging for users. And we know that that's what organisations want to do. They want engaging and inspiring content that their users actually want to read. And sometimes they want to be able to show people kind of how to do things or show a thing. But there are some things to think about when using images. Standard says non-text content should have an alternative in text that serves the equivalent purpose, which means that images that don't just serve decorative purposes need to have written content doing the same job. There's good reasons for this. Not everyone can see images, and that doesn't just apply to screen reader users. For a lot of people with visual impairments, the images can be really difficult to interpret. So we encourage our publishers to supply alternative text, alt text as it's known in HTML for images. We'll show you a couple of examples of places where this is particularly relevant. And these are real examples that we have found reasonably recently, not all of them from government websites. The assessment rating for the project, which is an image which says green amber, looks fine if you can see it, but there's no text equivalent here. So for a screen reader user, they'll only hear the header assessment, and that's missing quite an important piece of content. In this context, it's quite easy to understand why the publisher would want to use a bit of colour on the page and help the rating stand out. It is an important piece of content, and it adds a little bit of visual interest to what is otherwise quite a dry report. But that piece of content is now entirely inaccessible to quite a lot of users. Below that, there's a guide to what a council resident can recycle in their bins. There are little pictures of different types of rubbish, which can be quite helpful. You know, you can identify quite quickly that you can recycle your bus and train tickets. if that's what they look like. But there's a really easy fix to this, which is just to list the items on the page below the image. The last example, this is not a government website. This is a website I had to transact with recently, which had quite a lot of fun things in it. But these are office opening hours published as an image. So 10 a.m. To 7 p.m. Monday to Friday, and so on. Across the opening hours, the publishers use this text on a diagonal to say that hours may be different during the COVID period, which has the effect of making almost everything there absolutely unreadable. And I was struggling to read anything underneath it as well. I'm kind of guessing what's going on Saturday. And that would definitely have been better published as text. I suspect some of the more egregious stuff here that we're showing you is less common on council websites these days, but I think it's always worth bearing in mind that these things do pop up. Most CMSs and other tools will let you supply alt text. There are some examples of these here on this slide. In WordPress, it's there by default. We do enforce that for some of our customers' websites. They ask us to make sure that they have to put it in there. Google Slides, which we've used to create this presentation, will also allow you to do it, and Twitter does as well. Good alt text, there's quite a lot out there about what good alt text looks like, and I thought there was a RNIB blog post about this, which was very good. But briefly, alt text should be reasonably concise. It should describe the intent of the image. Why have you included this? It should describe what's in the image, and it also doesn't need to say this is an image of. If you're struggling to describe an image, it may be worth evaluating as to whether it should be text in the first place anyway. There's a couple of examples of alt text that we use on our own blogs on the DXW website. So the first blog post is some work we've done on affordable housing, which we've used a picture of a block of flats to illustrate. And the second is a case study of our work with DFE, and the alt text describes the image as a person using the service on a tablet. This is the slightly softer edge of alt text for me, and I think it's something worth considering. So decorative images technically don't need alt text, but sometimes I think it's worth considering whether the reason that you've included it for sighted users is to add a bit of visual interest and something to engage with on the page. And it's worth thinking about whether your non-sighted users also deserve that sort of same experience. Thinking about your motivation for including a particular image is probably a good way to work out kind of what the alt text should say. Still on the visual sort of angle, back to Callum to talk about videos.
So videos, yeah, the videos are similar in terms of images, in terms of looking at them as a way that makes content more digestible, more engaging, and certainly wouldn't prevent users from using them in the website. But there's certain things you need to consider before you go ahead and put a video on your website. There's 3 criteria which we'll be looking at this. There are additionally other aspects we might want to consider beyond accessibility, such as the overall performance of the page and whether or not users have their own broadband connection or availability to actually view the video on their internet connection. But beyond that, these are the main criteria that you need to adhere to. And if your video doesn't have an alternative format, such as captions, and the option to maybe have like a transcript if it's an extensive piece of content which has people talking about things, you need to include all of these aspects in your video. Next slide. So looking at a typical example we see here is probably just somebody put this video up quite quickly thinking it would just add to more engagement, more interest in the page. However, it goes against criteria, and as a consequence, this page would fail an accessibility audit. Now, in terms of a video, which is a good example here, we've got one from the government.uk website, and we've got the captions here and a transcript below. And having all of these features in a video just makes it more accessible to everybody who's viewing it, because there's a whole range of different disabilities which depend on these features, and otherwise a video doesn't provide anything to those users.
We're now going to talk about PDFs for a minute. This is going to be a slight rant on my part, and I'm sure it won't be unfamiliar to everyone. And then Callum will talk about some of the technical aspects about making accessible PDFs. Publishing good PDFs is hard, and we're not going to cover everything in this section about it because there's not enough time. But making accessible PDFs is in a lot of ways harder than making accessible web pages. However, we know that an awful lot of organisations still like to publish things as PDFs, and quite often we hear things like, "Oh well, it's only your annual report," or "It's only a committee minute," "It's only meeting records." So it's not like it's a transaction that we're making deliberately inaccessible. But the reality is that PDF is a format that's good for printing, and it's getting increasingly less likely that your users are actually going to print them out. So why are you insisting that on publishing information which is important enough to publish in this format? PDFs suck, which is going to be a hill I'm going to die on. I'm sure that you've all experienced an inner sigh when you click on something on your phone only for a big file to start downloading. They're almost impossible to read on mobile. You can't zoom into text very easily, for one thing, so you're endlessly stuck scrolling horizontally and vertically trying to make some sense of what's on the page. And they're an unpredictable experience for your users. Even though they may look the same, they may open in a new tab, a new browser window, or even in a separate application. And it's really hard to do things like cut and paste from them or link to specific sections. Quite a lot of these are not just accessibility issues, these are pain for everyone. I think it's worth thinking about the causes of PDFs and being tough on the causes of PDFs as well. They're probably easy to create from Word, probably easier than converting content into HTML. So you're putting that burden onto your users. They're predictably styled when they're printed on a larger screen. I think that's probably a legitimate use case for when you know that people are going to need to print things, but there is no real excuse there because it's perfectly possible to create good print style sheets from HTML. I think there's a thing about how they feel. They feel more like a finished document or a product in a way that an HTML page doesn't. And it might be easier to get sign off within your organizations for publishing things as PDF. And they're fixed in time. I think there's a perception that they are immutable in some way. So they'll never be changed and they are reliable. However, the reality is that you can just upload a different version of a PDF and I can go and Photoshop anything I like into a PDF and make it look plausible. So I'm not sure that's a very true perception. I am sorry about the rant. I'm sure it's not news to a lot of you. But I think it is going to take quite a long time and some concerted effort to change the working practices and perceptions within organisations of how to publish things. The PDF is so deeply embedded and ingrained into how people do things. But I think some of the challenge you could offer around this is, don't your visually impaired users deserve to be able to read the content you're publishing, or is the transparency content that you're publishing only for people with perfect eyesight on a large screen? And shouldn't everyone be able to read your job descriptions? I'll pass over to Callum to talk about what you can do to make them less bad. They're never going to be good.
Okay, so looking again at the criteria within the guidelines, these are criteria which, when we are auditing a website, we also look at the PDFs in terms of accessibility on these points. So looking again at things like the images, things we mentioned about images not having alt text. Again, there's ways of doing that in PDFs. And similarly with the headings and the structures, there's ways of making sure that those headings are persisted when you export them. Ensuring that all those aspects as well, such as the spacing of the text and spacing of content, is all accessible. Next slide. So looking at a bad example of PDFs that we looked at. In this case, we have no meaningful title. If you look at the top of the window, you'll see that the title is simply the file name. And to a screen reader user, that isn't clear or acceptable. And looking at the left-hand side, we simply have the thumbnails of the pages, which indicates that there is no table of contents. You can't skip to different pages to find out what is the heading on those pages. And related to that, there's no headings or labels. So it's not easy enough to navigate that document. Again, we've got an example here, some similar issues. The headers aren't legible, or they've used uppercase caps. In that case, it's not necessarily the more obvious disabilities, but anybody looking at headings when they're all in uppercase, it's quite difficult to work out which are the letters and which are the words between them. Now, looking at a good example here, we've got the title of the page, which is meaningful. We've got the table of contents to the left. A good way to test that is if you're opening a PDF and you look at the sidebar, do you have that table of contents? Do you see a logical order between the headings, and the small arrows to the left you can see, which then allows somebody who's using assistive technology to navigate the document in an easier way.
Sorry, I was still muted. We are at the end of our slides. We hope there's been some useful stuff in here. We've tried to give you some hint of what's in the standard and how you can use the standard as a weapon to publish better content. But we do really encourage you to read at least the Quick Ref Guide and the GDS campaign site, because they are both pretty good, so that you can get a bit more familiar with what you need to do. The deadline has now passed for making things compliant, but at some point GDS will probably start naming and shaming organisations who aren't. I did see that Scope had done an evaluation of some council websites and published that on the 23rd of September when the deadline happened. So that might be a useful mechanism in terms of managing reputational risk. Really happy to take some questions. I don't know if Nick is around to facilitate that or whether people just want to stick them in chat. I think Nick may be having some internet fun. Jill, you've asked if we can share the slides. Yes, certainly. I might just run through my speaker notes and make sure there's nothing bad in there. I will also try and better obfuscate some of the councils who we have named and shamed. Does anyone have any questions? Comment? Deafening silence.
Hi, Alex. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I am back, but that was a great presentation. Unfortunately, I had to sort of Zoom's gone crazy on my desktop, so I had to load it up to my mobile. Hence the slightly sort of late start and sort of very odd introduction. So apologies to both you and Callum, and also all our attendees for that somewhat sort of haphazard start. And thankfully, from what I could see, an excellent presentation and quite a few hints and tips as to what people can actually start doing back at their organisation with regards to getting themselves back on track with the new accessibility standards. I notice, Jill, and I would imagine a number of other people are wondering whether those slides and also this recording will be available. I'm assuming that it's okay with you and Callum to obviously make that public so people can check out the slides and the and your chat.
Yeah, fine by us.
Yeah,
and I'll get the slides into a format which is a bit more shareable. As I said, I think it may just be worth particularly looking at the links that are there at the beginning. So we'll make sure that they're really clear what we think the best things are to look at.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you very much to both of you for taking out the time for sharing your knowledge and insight into new standards, which I would imagine at some point, people are going to start being made examples of, and obviously it's better to start sooner rather than later, putting accessibility at the forefront of when you're creating content, just making it sure it's accessible from the get-go, and actually instilling that into people at creating content for your organisation. So well, you can hear this round of applause from me, but thank you very much indeed, both to you and Callum. I look forward to seeing the rest of the attendees possibly at sessions tomorrow. But for now, I'm going to end the session. Thanks very much once again, Callum and Alex. Cheers.